This is Brian Burris with Longacre Racing Products. I'm here with Ben Baker. We're going to go over the differences in between our new SMI style gauges and our old SMI style gauges. And Ben Baker, what's the difference in between the two there?
So the biggest difference between the old style versus new style is the fact that the new style is 100% waterproof. We went through a lot of testing and working with manufacturing to get it where those gauges are compliant with the same standards that you use on jet skis and motorcycles to make sure the gauge doesn't get any kind of moisture in it. And for the most part, that's been the downfall of a stepper motor gauge across the whole market is, some of the reliability issues that they had was led to water damage and dirt and debris getting some. So these new gauges are completely sealed up and completely waterproof. I've got one of the new LED gauges here, and this is one of the SMI style gauges. Both of these gauges are 100% waterproof. Some of the things that you'll notice a little different in this new style is there was a red warning light down here, and we removed that warning light, and the backlight itself will actually change colors depending on which warning it is. So on oil pressure, the backlight will change to a red. For water temperature, the backlight will change to a yellow. So it'll change those colors to give you the warning. The other thing you'll do is on the second warning is once it goes to that color, then it'll start flashing at you. So you've got a couple of different options and very visible things to see that warning. These gauges, like the other ones, are completely programmable. You can set your own warning temperatures, your own warning pressures to kind of customize what you want to see. When you look at the back of the gauge, one of the key things here you can see is this plug. This is a key distinction between the old style and new style. This was the type of plug on the old style, the one here on the right. This pin mechanism here wasn't waterproof at all. You get a lot of corrosion in here on these pins. If the car set in an area where, had a lot of moisture in the air or set over winter, it could corrode around these pins. With this one, like I say, it's completely waterproof, completely sealed off, so you don't have that issue anymore. One of the other things with these gauges is you do have the capability of doing some recalls. So like on the pressures and temperatures, you actually can do a high pressure or a low pressure recall on those. So you can very easily tell if there was some kind of a problem. But that's some of the biggest differences and biggest changes between the new style gauges and the old style gauges. Now, if you're going to retrofit, let's say you have the old style and you want to upgrade to these new style, we do sell this now in just a gauge only package that comes with the gauge, and then will come with the wiring harness. But you do not have to buy the sensors along with it. The sensors are interchangeable between the old style and the new style.
It's very nice to have a completely waterproof gauge now that you do not have to worry about it getting wet. So it can be used in our pavement late models, dirt late models, sprint cars, anywhere that you're going to have some moisture. It's going to keep that a lot better from getting corrosion and gauge failure.
Yep.
Next thing a lot of guys ask about on these gauges also is installation. There is some of the gauges that need to be installed with sensors on them, and these sensors are sensitive of where you actually install them. And Ben, would you go over with us how to install these gauges actually in your car?
Yeah, so installing them, like Brian talked about, the pressure sensors is one of the things that we want to be very sensitive of. Those sensors are very sensitive to heat and vibration. So, traditionally you would mount a pressure sensor or run a pressure line directly from the port on the engine to the gauge, or in some cases people would just screw the sensor itself into the block or right on the fuel log of the carburetor. And those harmonics and vibrations that the engines make, over time, it would distort and damage those sensors itself. So What we have now is we have firewall blocks. It's basically a block of aluminum that has a through hole in it that bolts to the firewall of the car. You screw your sensors into the top of that firewall block, and then you run a flexible line from the engine to that block, and that gets the sensor itself off of the engine. Even though, yes, the engines are, they're mounted solid in the car, it's still just that direct harmonics of being mounted on the engine. You're isolating that gauge itself. The other thing to look at when installing them is your wires and which ones to connect. There's instructions in the manuals on how to install these, but on the needle style gauges, you're going to have 3 wires like this. So your black wire is your ground. It's very important to make sure you have a good ground. Your red wire needs to go to a 12-volt source that is hot all the time. So you can run this to the positive side of your battery disconnect switch, or you can run it directly to the battery itself. The brown wire is basically the ignition switch. So you're going to run this to the switch when you get ready to turn the car on and turn your switches on or your gauges on, and this tells the gauge itself to turn on. So what's important with this red wire, and the reason why we want to have it to a full-time power source in the case of the needle style gauge, is that red wire tells this needle to go back to 0. So if we're up here at, say, 160 degrees, and we don't have that red wire hooked to a constant battery source, when you turn the switch off, the needle stays at 160 degrees. It won't go back to 0, which in some cases that's fine. It doesn't bother some, but in others, they want to make sure it goes back to 0. So that's one of the key things, is making sure you do have that constant 12-volt source just to make the switch go back to 0 and restart from that position. We talked about pressure sensors, how they matter and where they're mounted. On the temperature sensors, it really doesn't matter. These things are not as fragile as what the pressure sensors are. So you can mount these in a traditional position, whether it be in the oil pan or in the oil tank or on the radiator or in the intake manifold. There's no issue with where you mount the pressure sensor itself.
Like Ben said, on them gauges there on that wiring, you do need to make sure that you have a good ground, and make sure there's no powder coating or paint around that. That's one very common mistake on gauges and wiring, is not having a good ground.
Yep.
Also, Ben, do we sell lines and different things that you might need and pressure blocks for these to mount on your firewalls?
We do. We've got it's a 1-port, 2-port, and 3-port pressure block. So if you're just running 1 port where you're running just oil pressure, we have that. If you're running 2 ports, where most common is oil pressure, fuel pressure, we have a block for that. And then the 3-port is oil pressure, fuel pressure, and water pressure. So with all 3 of those, you can get them on the firewall. And then we do have what we call gauge lines. So that port has 1/8" MPT on both sides of the block itself. So instead of having to run put a fitting in the block and then have a line to go from that fitting to the engine, we have what we call a gauge line. So you can run -3 or -4 off of the engine, run your flexible line up, and then on one end of the flexible line, it's actually 1/8" MPT, so it just screws right into the block.
Okay.
So we've got them available in several different lengths.
Several different links for different cars.
Yep.
Good to know. If you got any more questions, please go to longacreracing.com.